Okay, guys, I'm joined today by Dr. Andrew Kaufman. I'm going to put his credentials in the description and in the pinned comment, but what I do want you to know is he is a graduate from MIT. He knows his stuff. I've had a pretty long conversation with him recently, and this guy is genuine. And what we need in this day and age is people who are genuine, who are not afraid to speak the truth. Because if it's one thing we know about truth, the first casualty in any war is truth, including the information war. So, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Brian.
I'm going to start off with a question that I got from one of my listeners, Patrick London, who's going to, I'm just going to press on you from the get-go, man, okay?
I can take it.
All right. He says, the government lies all the time. Find out why he, that's you, thinks I should trust him any more than I trust the fear-mongering World Hoax Organization.
Sure, and that certainly is a fair question. So I would ask him, what possible motive would I have to be dishonest about this information? I'm actually taking quite a number of risks by speaking about this publicly, risking my livelihood, my medical license, my reputation. I've already lost several friends who don't understand what I'm talking about. So really, this would be a very poor proposition for me if I wanted to do it dishonestly.
And I'm assuming the risk is because you're basically going against the grain of the entire medical community?
Absolutely.
All right.
But not the entire community, because every day I'm seeing more and more doctors speaking out. And in fact, more and more doctors and other medical professionals are reaching out to me and telling me their story and asking for more information so that they can look at it themselves and make their own decision about what they think is happening.
All right, fair enough. All right, my first question is, we are being railroaded these days. Our freedoms are being taken away from us. Our rights are eroding. The Federal Reserve has moved in, is trying to buy up assets with fiat currency, and they're doing it all under the guise of there's a COVID-19 in the streets and it's going to kill us. From your understanding, from which you've studied, what is COVID-19? I'll just leave it at that. What is COVID-19?
Well, that's a very kind of tricky question to answer. And I think there's multiple perspectives that you can look at it from. So one perspective that I've recently talked about is the perspective of what is this particle that has been shown in some papers to come out of some people who are ill. And I believe that that particle, based upon my research, is not a virus as we understand it, meaning some kind of living or non-living, depending on your opinion, piece of material that comes from outside and invades us and causes an illness. What I have found is that there is a part of our body called an exosome. And I learned about this from virologists, so those are scientists who study viruses, that they have seen the homology or similarities between exosomes and viruses. And there are many papers out there stating that a virus and an exosome are the same things. One of the most prominent researchers in HIV, who was at Johns Hopkins, actually made a statement about this, Dr. John Hildreth. So I started investigating what exosomes are, and I could not believe the amount of similarities of things that were identical between what has been claimed about the COVID-19 virus and what has been shown in various experimental studies about exosomes. And further, when I first looked at electron microscope photographs of the virus and then looked at electron microscope photographs of exosomes, they were virtually indistinguishable from each other in appearance.
Okay, so are you saying there are exosomes and there are viruses and never the twain shall meet, or are people looking at exosomes calling them viruses?
Well, it's even more complicated than that, but certainly one possibility, a strong possibility, is that people are looking at exosomes and causing them viruses. But I think it's important to go back in history a little bit, because the word virus comes from the ancient Latin, and what it means is a noxious substance or poison. And so before the era of microbiology, before microscopes were even invented, and people had no idea that there were such a thing as microorganisms, they used the term virus, and they used it in the context of studying illness. They thought it was some kind of substance that was in the air at that time that would you would breathe in and would cause disease. But they really didn't have experimental studies to show that it was more of an idea or a theory. Later on, when the microscope was invented and we started realizing that there were bacteria and fungi and other small organisms like amoeba that we could see, that led to thinking that could it be that those microorganisms cause disease? And this is known as the germ theory. Louis Pasteur is most famous for putting that theory forward, but actually the idea predated him by a number of decades. And as science progressed and technology progressed, the electron microscope was invented because the particles that have been subsequently identified as viruses are too small to see under a conventional optical microscope with lenses. So the electron microscope allowed them to visualize these tiny little particles, and that led to the theory based upon germ theory that these particles, which they then termed viruses, are responsible for causing several diseases. And basically, at the time, the diseases that they applied this to were diseases that they did not know the cause, that they believed to be infectious. Now, go ahead.
So then let me ask you this. Are you saying that you believe, in your opinion, that COVID-19 is an exosome-related situation?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Okay, so then now they're using as justification to lock us up in America and really the world at large that, hey, we gotta self-quarantine, we gotta social distance, we gotta wash our hands 30 or 40 times a day. Is an exosome, what you're calling an exosome, something that can be transmitted from one person to another?
Well, it's not fully known if that's the case. It has not been studied, but I don't think that that is the most important thing about exosomes. What the important thing is that exosomes have been shown to be not a cause of illness, but rather a response to illness. And their role in the response to illness is to facilitate healing. So, for example, there's one particular study that I looked at closely that has demonstrated that exosomes are able to gobble up toxic substances. So what they did was they mixed some cells, human cells or mammalian cells, with bacteria. And these were bacteria that were secreting toxic, they call them endotoxins. And if our cells are exposed to those endotoxins, it actually bores little holes in the cell membrane, and then the contents of the cell leaks out and the cell dies. So what they did is they mixed the bacteria with those toxins with cells that were not expressing exosomes, and all of the cells died. And then they had another group of cells that were expressing exosomes, and those cells survived. And they were able to capture some images of under the electron microscope of those toxins actually inside the exosomes. So essentially what they were doing is containing them so that they could not cause the damage to the cell. So this is one real excellent example where the exosomes help us heal from an insult or an injury or a disease rather than being the cause. So the particle size of the exosome is virtually identical to the claimed size of the COVID virus, which is about 500 nanometers, and a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. So they're very, very tiny. Incidentally, much smaller than the pore size of these masks, including the N95 masks, which would provide no barrier at all. They would go right through it.
Which the World Health Organization originally said was the case, right? But now you have, we're making 50 million masks or whatever, which it's not going to work, right?
Absolutely, and you can even find scientific papers that show this. So this is not just by my reasoning, it's actually there's papers that highlight this. But so if these exosomes were able to spread from one person to the other, I would postulate that they would actually serve as a warning to the person who received them that there could be some kind of toxic exposure, and it would help prepare their body to deal with that.
So if they're not, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there's not scientific evidence behind that. This is just my opinion about it. I want to be clear because I think it's crucial to the audience that when I make a claim, I'm making it based upon a solid scientific study with good evidence. And when there's areas where there's gaps of this evidence, and so all you can do is make an opinion or generate a hypothesis. But I want to mention that specifically so that your audience knows what can be backed up with scientific evidence and what is just a reasonable conclusion by putting things together where no evidence exists.
Okay, so if exosomes, as you say, are not the cause of the sickness, but rather the effect of a sickness that's already present, is that the right understanding?
That's correct.
Then why are all these people getting sick at the same time? How can that even be possible?
Sure. Well, I think you should consider an example like this. Let's say that you attend a dinner with a large group of people at a restaurant, and you have a very nice evening. However, let's say there's 25 people in the group. So somewhere around the middle of the night that evening, let's say 12 people out of the group wake up and have vomiting and diarrhea, right? So they've all gotten sick at the same time together. Many of them may be couples and they're living in the same house, and maybe both people are ill, or maybe only one is ill and the other one is not ill. Now, the reason that they woke up in the middle of the night with vomiting and diarrhea is not because they passed some infectious agent between each other. It's because they all ate a certain dish at the restaurant that was contaminated with food poisoning. So this is an example of how you could be misled by your observations and assume that it's a contagious process that passes an illness between people, when in actuality it is that they had a common exposure to some kind of toxic insult that caused the problem.
All at the same time in mass? Okay, so let me just play devil's advocate. So are there things in life that cause contagion? Like, let's say, people call it the Spanish flu of 1918. Was that actually a contagious event?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because there is a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, and it describes that right after the Spanish flu pandemic, which, by the way, resulted in 50 million deaths.
Right.
Okay, so that is way, 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 way more than our current situation. But the U.S. Public Health Service really wanted to get to the bottom of how this disease is spread so that if there was a future outbreak, they would know how to contain it. So they did a series of 3 experiments with people. They did some additional animal experiments as well. But the experiments with the humans, they had 100 healthy subjects. And then they had several people who were sick with the flu. So what they did is they had the people who were sick with the flu cough up as much nasty stuff as they could. They put swabs in their nose to collect the snot. They even swabbed their eyeballs. So they were trying to collect all of the particles that they thought were infectious that they could then deliver to a healthy person and make them sick. So in the first experiment, what they did is they squirted these secretions into the nose, eyes, and throat of the healthy people. And out of those 100 healthy people, not one of them became ill with the flu. So they thought, well, we need to try harder, and they devised a second experiment. In the second experiment, they took the same secretions from the sick person who was coughing and sneezing and tearing, and they then injected that into the healthy subjects. And once again, none of the subjects became ill with the flu. So they devised a third experiment thinking that perhaps a more natural, casual human contact is required for transmission of the disease. And so what they did is they had the person who was sick with the flu sit really close, like uncomfortably close to the healthy subject. And they had a conversation for like 5 or 10 minutes. I forget the exact time. And then after that, they had the sick individual take a deep breath in and the healthy individual take a deep breath out, and they put their lips together almost as if they were kissing, but no contact. And the sick person blew all of his breath into the healthy person who inhaled it all. And the results of that experiment once again showed that none of the healthy subjects became ill. So I've tried very hard to find additional experiments where they tested this theory about contagion of infectious agents. And I could not find any conclusive studies that proved contagion exists.
So what happened in 1918? What do you theorize, or do you know? Do you know for a fact what happened?
Well, I did not spend time researching the Spanish flu pandemic, so I really can't say with certainty. But there is a theory that there was a major development of infrastructure of the electric grid that immediately preceded the pandemic. And there is some interesting evidence that I've not yet examined because my reading list keeps growing higher and higher. But and it's in that book that I mentioned, The Invisible Rainbow, but I would definitely like to take a closer look at that. One of the other doctors who is talking about these issues now, Dr. Thomas Cowan, who was really a major inspiration for me in coming up with this theory about the exosomes, he's talked more about that, so I suggest your listeners check out some of his material if they want to learn more about that.
Okay, just real quick before we leave the Spanish flu, because I heard, and maybe you've heard too, but that it originated with the Rockefeller Foundation injecting servicemen at Fort Riley, Kansas, and they got infected and they went abroad, infected the French and everybody on their boat. Is there anything to that? And do we know if it was viral or bacterial?
Right. Well,
and does it matter? Does it even matter?
Well, I think it does matter because it's important that we understand what is the true cause of disease, because it's only if we have that knowledge and it's been tested and validated that we can then know how do we approach, containing this disease or preventing it in the future. Yep.
Okay, so we're at the point, because I just basically said a word that I said viral instead of exosomal. I mean, should we pivot to a more accurate word if that's indeed what this is?
Right. Well, it is very confusing because the term virus is applied to a lot of situations and it coincides with different usage. So it can be very complicated. In my opinion, I think that referring to it as an exosome really changes the meaning because remember I said the meaning of virus is a poison. Well, an exosome is the antidote to the poison. So essentially they're almost the opposite thing from each other. So if we realize that what is being called by the authorities and the media as a virus is actually an exosome, then it tells us that there is something else that is causing people to become ill.
So what are you saying that flu season actually is? Like the CDC's already got, since October 1st, 2019, 30,000 people have already died from just regular influenza, aside from whatever COVID-19 may or may not be. So what causes flu season every single year?
Well, to be honest, I don't really know the true answer to that. And the reason for that is because germ theory has been so widely accepted as a fundamental principle that all of our other scientific knowledge is based upon. There has been no effort or funding or research done to look for an alternative cause.
And why do you think that is?
Well, from the point of view of scientists, since they accept that the virus causes the disease, there would be no point in doing other research to look at other potential causes. And so they spend their research efforts to learn more about these particles that they're calling viruses. And furthermore, the way research is done is that because scientific research is extremely expensive. So there are some private foundations with endowments that do fund a very, very small percentage of the scientific research, but the overwhelming majority is funded by government grants. And the way this apparatus works is that the different government agencies that are part of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, they have specific research goals and areas that they want to study. So they put out these publications that describe the type of subjects that they want research done, and that's what they're going to fund. So they're not putting out grants to look for alternative causes of these diseases because they're not interested in that.
So what would you say to somebody who's scared, literally scared to death? I've met people. I talked to one of my relatives just a couple of days ago, and they said, no, we can't come out of our houses. We have to practice social distancing. This person is an athlete. They jog all the time and all that, and they maintain social distancing measures. They make sure they're washing their hands. What would you tell somebody who's absolutely 100% fearful about getting COVID-19 and becoming one of those dreaded statistics on the Johns Hopkins red line death chart, and we'll talk about how they get those numbers and confirmation, but what would you tell somebody who's freaked out about this right now?
Well, the first thing that I want to tell people is that I respect everyone making their own decision about this. And whatever your decision is, if you would like to remain scared and follow all of the recommendations that are coming forward, that certainly is your decision. I'm not going to make decisions for anyone else. But it's important to realize that when you are consumed by fear, that you're in a mode of survival, and you can only think a certain way about your own survival. And you cannot be receptive to new ideas or new ways of thinking about things when you're consumed with fear. So if you're able to take some deep breaths, take a walk, meditate, spend time with your loved ones, and you find that the fear subsides, then I would encourage you to try and look at some of the actual evidence of what's going on. And if you simply look at the mortality figures, I think that is a great place to start, because you can just disregard the error in those figures and accept the numbers put out by the World Health Organization or the CDC as true, and then compare them to other numbers put forth by those organizations. And then ask yourself, does this degree of mortality or deaths really warrant the drastic draconian measures that are being placed upon us? And then I think there's another thing that's important to look at, and this is related to what I said earlier about the masks, that if there is really a very scary and deadly disease that we can pass so readily from one to another, that we have to stay contained in our homes almost all the time, why are we allowed to go to places like the supermarket where we are in close proximity to each other and would clearly spread the disease? Or why would we be able to also go pick up takeout food at restaurants if the cooks and other personnel in the restaurants were carrying this alleged virus? Wouldn't they be spreading it to dozens and dozens of people who they're giving food to? So why is it that these measures would allow transmission of the virus, but we still have to be confined to our own areas and maintain this distance between people?
Yeah, and maybe we shouldn't give tyrants any more ideas, because I mean, if they listen to this show, yeah, that's right. No more supermarkets, no more carry out. I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. That's really a good point. And another thing too that I tell a lot of people is, what's good for the government, or what the government tells you to do, they don't practice themselves. When you see Trump and all the other officials, the COVID response team getting up, they're shoulder to shoulder, they're bumping arms, they're shaking hands, they're touching their eyes, they're touching their mouth. They're not practicing the very things that they're demanding that we obey, or else. So that's a really good point. Well, what is, just out of curiosity, what's the micron level of the N95 mask as opposed to this, the exosome?
Yes, I believe that the pore size is in the micron scale, which is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, whereas I said before, the virus is on the scale of 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So there's an order of magnitude difference. It's, imagine if you're a 6-foot tall individual walking through a door that is 60 feet tall. It would be no problem to get through.
Right. So you might
Right.
as well not even have a mask on, basically. Right?
Absolutely.
If
There's that.
if it was transmittable, but you're saying there's no evidence to show that it is transmittable. As a matter of fact, from what you just told me about the experiments done in 1918, there's evidence that it's not transmittable. If you can put a swab in somebody's nose who's infected with something that's making them sick, and you put it into a healthy person's nose, and what was it, 10 out of 10 times nobody got anything, then there's proof that it's not transmittable, right?
Right. It was actually 100 times, and it was 3 different experiments. So you could say it was 300 times.
Okay, so it's a 300 time failure rate for trying to transmit something that everybody see. That's the thing, Andrew. Everybody's under the assumption, and that's the fear base right there. What if everybody knew automatically in their minds right now that, hey, I can go outside, I can go to the supermarket, I can go to that restaurant and have dinner with my wife. I'm not going to get it because you can't get it like that. If everybody could just turn their mind on, that's why it's so valuable to get this kind of information out. But how do they solidify? How does that gel in their minds? How does it cement in their minds that, oh, everything that I've always thought I knew about viruses, that you could actually get it and I could die? So you're saying somebody who's got an infection can go visit their 85-year-old grandmother, or what are we saying here?
Well, I think it's important to be around your loved ones and the people you care about in this time. And I like to say that personally, I am going out there and I'm doing things and trying to live as normal a life as possible. And I'm not afraid of getting sick from anyone. However, people don't respond to me that way themselves. I mean, last weekend, took my children for a walk around the neighborhood. It was a sunny afternoon. And 2 times this happened during a 20-minute walk, that someone was coming the opposite direction down the street, and when they got about 20 feet away from us, they put their head down to avoid eye contact and crossed the street. And I'm really afraid that this is going to be the new normal for public interactions among people, and it's going to have a devastating effect on our psychology.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that leads me to my next question, but I wanted to make another observation about what you just said. Is Andrew Cuomo just said yesterday in a press briefing, this is our new normal. Basically, get used to it, because the encroachments that the government has made, don't expect us to take it back. This is how it's going to be. And so, we've been unsocialized through social media. You see, like you go out into a restaurant, and that's all you see. People just looking at their phones, and they're not even having interaction with their loved ones. They're so absorbed with what's on this little screen here. And now it's going to be 10 times worse. So that's what I wanted to do, is peel back that layer of deception, because it's kind of like, have you ever seen the illustration? It's a meme of this gigantic horse that's tethered to this little plastic Walmart chair. Have you ever seen that?
No, it sounds interesting.
And the thing that keeps that horse there is just in his mind, because he weighs 1,500 pounds. He could easily take that chair wherever he wants. But because he thinks that chair is his master, and there's no way I could possibly go anywhere. See, that's why I want to have this conversation with you, Andrew, because if we can peel back that layer of deception, then it's a new game, and it's literally a new day. Because the reason people are voluntarily locking themselves in, like I said in a couple of my videos, about a week and a half ago, hashtag lockdown Seattle was trending on Twitter, and it was people demanding that the government lock everybody down because everybody's scared, and they want to flatten the curve, and they want to make sure everything's okay before they step outside, because they don't want to give something to somebody, and they don't want to get something from somebody. So if we can break through with some knowledge, like Schoolhouse Rock said back in the 70s, knowledge is power. And if you don't have knowledge, then you have ignorance. And then any psychopathic puppet can come along and capitalize on and exploit that ignorance. And that's exactly what's happening. So you're saying
can I speak to that?
Yeah. Please.
Well, yeah, I want to say, because this is a really excellent point that you make, and I want to sort of highlight that, ever since we're young children, we are taught to respect authority figures. And we're also taught that there are experts in various areas, and we should rely on experts to tell us what to do and what's going on. And I want to tell everyone out there that I don't subscribe to that policy. We are all capable of reasoning and thinking for ourselves. And it's crucial that we do that, especially at this time. And if you do some investigation and do some thinking, you'll quickly find out that what's going on just really doesn't make sense. And then you will be in a much better position to make a decision for yourself, and you'll feel much less fear about getting sick. You may be afraid of other things happening, but you will not worry about getting sick nearly as much. Because if you look at how many people have died from this, it is such a tiny number compared to things that we deal with every single year.
Yeah, if that number is even true, right? Which leads us to my next question. What about these confirmed cases? Already you see on the Johns Hopkins death chart, the COVID-19 death chart, we're up to over 1 million confirmed cases. How can anybody have any confidence in that number, and how do they even arrive at that number? Do you know?
Yes. I'm not sure specifically how Johns Hopkins arrives at that number. I would hope that I would assume that it would be based upon testing results. But I want to say that the test that they're using, which is a PCR test that does not measure any virus, it measures genetic material that is supposed to represent the virus, but is not the virus. That test has many, many problems with its accuracy. And even the Centers for Disease Control themselves have put out information on their website telling us that test is problematic. And one of the things that they stated, and this is not verbatim, but it's close, is that a positive test for COVID-19 does not mean that they have the COVID-19 disease. So in other words, even if they have evidence of this alleged virus in their body, the test does not tell them if that's what is causing them to be ill or not. So for example, they could have a regular pneumonia and then have a positive test, and the pneumonia is not caused by the virus, it's caused by something else. And this is what the CDC themselves say. So, take their word for it if you like, right. Because most people would say that they're more credible and reliable than I am. And I want to also go back.
If that's true, and they trusted what they said about their own numbers, then they wouldn't even trust what they're seeing on the Johns Hopkins site, right?
Well, they
couldn't possibly be accurate.
Absolutely. And, the way that the deaths are being recorded is also problematic because there was great data put forth by the Italian government where they looked at all of the fatalities and they saw that 50% of them were in people that had not one, not two, but 3 serious illnesses. So this would be like someone who had, cancer and heart failure, and kidney failure. So someone in that very vulnerable and frail state of health, if they got the common cold, they could succumb to their ultimate demise. So it's not really telling us that it's serious based upon that. Now, the amount of people who were healthy and did not have any serious health conditions who died in Italy, according to their government's data, was only 0.8%. And that's a really important number because most of us don't think about this, but every year, every individual has a risk of death. And right, because you know that overall the death rate is 1 per person.
Right.
So,
100%.
But in the United States, the annual death rate for any general member of the public is 0.9%. So just under 1 in 100 chances of dying. Now, we know that most of those deaths actually occur in people who are older and people who are ill, but that number is averaged over the entire population. So if you say that in Italy, only 0.8% of people with the COVID illness died, that's actually lower than the death rate for any person who may be healthy.
Right.
So that tells you that it's not even a threat in terms of mortality for healthy people.
Well, let me also remind everybody who's watching this, according to are you familiar with that New England Journal of Medicine where Anthony Fauci wrote in there talking about the influenza virus versus the COVID-19? He said, quote, the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. When the World Health Organization originally came out and said it was 3.4%, Anthony Fauci, the head of the COVID task force, is saying it's 0.1%. So we're shutting down the entire world for a 0.1% case fatality rate. It makes zero sense.
I totally agree. And, you know, I have been very critical of Dr. Fauci because a couple of days after he wrote that in the New England Journal, and I want to, tell your viewers that the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the most prominent and prestigious medical journals in the world. But it's not for a lay public audience. This is only researchers and some physicians read this journal at all. So in that article, Dr. Fauci is talking to doctors, basically, telling us that we don't need to worry that this is not going to cause any massive number of deaths. But 1 or 2 days after that, he had a press conference with the president, and like you mentioned before, they were standing shoulder to shoulder. They were not observing any social distancing whatsoever, not setting an example for what they preach. And Dr. Fauci said that basically the peak hasn't arisen yet, and there's going to be massive deaths, so we have to, for a whole other month, extend these draconian measures. So essentially, he completely contradicted his editorial to the doctors when he was speaking to the general public. And this is why it is so crucial for people out there to investigate these things for themselves and see that they're being misled and misinformed by the most authoritative and expert people that we have in our government.
Yeah, and I just want to, on that note of the expert and authoritative people, I just want to impress on everybody. If you had, let's say you had an uncle who all he ever did was lie to you. He has a history of lying to you, to your dad, to your mom, to your other uncles, to your grandparents. Would you ever trust one word that he ever said? Now, let's skip to our time right now. It's said that if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. History, time and time again, we were lied to get into Vietnam. It cost the lives of over 58,000 servicemen, 1.5 to 3 million Vietnamese, what they call collateral damage, all because of a lie called the Gulf, that formulated in the Gulf of Tonkin, called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution under LBJ. Basically, they said the USS Maddox was fired on by torpedo boats, and that never happened. It comes out after it was declassified that it never happened. Operation Northwoods, to get us to foment war and use that as a justification to get people to ask, to American people to beg for war so that they could invade Cuba. It was declassified. So we have weapons of mass destruction, 9/11, the Korean War, the Second World War, the creation of the Federal Reserve. We've constantly been lied to about government. What are the odds that the government is now telling us the truth about COVID-19? Pretty remote. So when they roll out the experts and they tell you, hey, we're the authorities, you need to lock yourselves in, social distancing, when they're not practicing it themselves, it's insanity to actually trust a government. And now we find ourselves in the middle of repeating the history that we're doomed to repeat because we didn't learn from past history. So here's another question from Moving Forward asks, what is the role of, before he asks this, let me ask you something. Is there such a thing as the immune system? And if there is there anything that we can do to beef it up, to enhance it, to make it stronger?
Right. Well, certainly there is an immune system. I don't agree with exactly how it has been portrayed to us that it's based on this warfare model. I mean, all of modern medicine, it seems, and this seems to be rooted in the germ theory itself, is based on this model of warfare that, we've had a war on cancer, we've had a war on drugs, right? And
right.
The immune system fits right into that paradigm that there are things outside of us that come and invade us. And we have this army of defenders, and there's even one type of cell in your immune system that has been called a natural killer cell. So it's almost like our immune system is psychopathic, that that it's a killers. But I think what the reality of the immune system is that it's more like the operations management and support system. that it directs resources in your body to handle virtually every situation. So this includes when there is a breach of our body's integrity, like when you get an injury or a break in the skin, that, our body has the skin to protect us from things outside so that it can maintain a healthy internal environment. So the immune system does respond in those situations. And, that's where it could be portrayed as somewhat of a defense system. But the immune system also coordinates various other operations. And one of its main roles actually is to locate and remove toxic substances from our body. In our modern society, we're all exposed to so many, thousands of substances from a variety of sources, from processed food, from pesticides and herbicides used in food, from industrial contaminants and heavy metals in our water supply, to air pollution, both outdoor and indoor, to the chemicals used in cleaning products, in personal hygiene products, our laundry, synthetic plastics used to make textiles for our clothing that have been demonstrated to leach chemicals into our body. So in our modern era, we're actually assaulted with toxic substances. And the immune system plays a vital role in helping clean those out of our body. And I think that one of the keys to maintaining health is actually to support our immune system's ability to remove those toxins. And in actuality, some of those approaches have been shown to be very effective in treating people who have been diagnosed with this respiratory illness that they call COVID-19. And so I want to draw your attention to one of those approaches, which is simply vitamin C. Now, vitamin C is always talked about as something that boosts our immune system, and it does cause our immune system to secrete certain substances that affects how it works and seems to improve it. But I think the bigger role of vitamin C is that it's an antioxidant. And what happens in our body is that these toxic substances, and even our own body actually makes some toxic things as a result of just metabolizing sugar, for example. But many of these substances can form what are known as free radicals. And free radicals are a very dangerous type of chemical because they undergo this chain reaction and they react with virtually everything. And like hydrogen peroxide is an example of this. And if you've ever used hydrogen peroxide to remove a stain from your clothing, what you'll see is, like for blood stains, I learned about this during my medical training, hydrogen peroxide works really well. And you just pour it on there and instantly almost you see the red disappear. And what's happening is that you have initiated a chain reaction of free radicals that basically destroyed all of the biomolecules in that blood that were staining the shirt and dissolved it into the water. So you could imagine that if this occurs inside of our body, it could be very, very destructive. It could destroy a lot of tissue and essentially dissolve it away. So our body has its own mechanisms to protect against this. And this is what you hear about when people talk about antioxidants. And one of the main ones in our body that's made by our liver is called glutathione. And you can support glutathione by foods that are high in sulfur, like some leafy greens. Some people actually take a sulfur supplement. But vitamin C also serves in this role, and it's very powerful it basically soaks up these free radicals like a sponge and neutralizes them. So just like if there's a fire and you spray it with water, it puts out the fire. And that's what vitamin C does for these free radical chain reactions. And I believe that is actually why it's helping people recover quickly from this respiratory illness.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. Getting back to the exosomes, we don't want to destroy the exosomes, right? Because if they're doing their job as kind of the garbage men cleaning up the mess, we want to kind of leave them be, right? Is that, or am I thinking wrong about that?
No, you're absolutely correct. So let me just explain a little bit of the basics about exosomes.
Wait, before you do that,
Sure.
Does vitamin C, because you were talking about vitamin C, does it adversely affect exosomes, or does it help? Does it help exosomes?
Well, I don't know that it has any effect at all on exosomes, but if one of the functions of exosomes that I was talking about before is to gobble up toxic substances in our body. And,
Right.
you know, in studies, it's been shown to do that for a variety of different toxins, including some like pesticide type chemicals and heavy metals, as well as bacterial toxins.
And isn't there an amount that it can gobble up compared to its size? Isn't there some kind of like ratio? It can gobble up 50 times its size, or am I thinking of something different?
No, I think you're thinking of something different. But
Okay.
but when a cell is damaged by some type of insult, it releases these exosomes, and there's lots of experiments to show that. But it can release quite a number of them. So even if they're small, the number of them may rise to the challenge of whatever it needs to do. You know, there's always a chance that our body can be so overwhelmed that we may not be able to recover from some kind of insult.
Right.
But in general, our bodies are quite resilient.
Right. We got to talk about vaccines. We got to talk about it. Are there ever, and let me try to start from the good side on vaccines, okay? Are there ever any good vaccines that are beneficial to the human body? For example, the vaccine for rabies. Somebody gets bit by a dog or something that's rabid, and you know it's certain death. Rabies, right? Rabies is a real thing, correct?
Well, I think there's actually some contradictory evidence, but rabies is a very, very rare disease. As a doctor, I've not ever seen one case of it. So it'd be really hard to speak about that without having that experience. But I can talk about the other diseases which are treated with, you know, which were given routine vaccinations for. You know, no one would be offered a rabies vaccine unless they were bit by an animal who was shown to have rabies.
Right, right.
And that is so rare that, like I said, I've never seen a case. I have seen people that received the rabies vaccination, but I've not seen a person with rabies. But if you look back at the evidence for these vaccines, what you'll find is that, and what I would like, encourage people to look at is look at how many people in the United States year by year were sick with this illness and how many people died from it. And you can do this for measles, you could do it for diphtheria, you could do it for polio, and you'll find the same exact results because I've looked at it for every disease that I could find data for, including the three that I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And what you'll see is that the prevalence, which is the number of people that have the disease at any given time, was started going down well before there was any vaccine and reached basically quite a low level before any vaccine for that disease was even available. So if the disease essentially went away before we even have a vaccine, how does that prove that the vaccine had any role whatsoever in eradicating that disease?
Right.
And furthermore, there's a standard of testing in medicine called a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And this is the gold standard of a test to evaluate a new treatment of any kind, whether it be a drug, a surgery, a procedure, or a vaccine. And in order to get approval for a drug or any of those other things from the FDA, you have to demonstrate that you've done this kind of a study. And it's very important because there are placebo effects. Our body has a very powerful ability to, if we believe something is going to help, that it actually can make our body respond and get better from a condition. So in order to not have that effect contaminate the results and make a treatment seem that it's more effective than it is, what they do is they have one group of people that they give the treatment to, and another group that they give a completely inert placebo that couldn't do anything to their body. So if this was for a vaccine study, they would give the vaccine to one group of people, and the other group of people, they would give water, a water injection.
Right.
Okay, or saline.
Right.
And because that doesn't have any effect on the body in terms of curing or preventing illness. And we know that for sure. But I'll tell you that there have only been one or two or three of those studies ever done for vaccines at all. And they've only been done for one or two vaccines. And now we have a schedule of, I don't remember what the current number, but I want to think it's in the 20s or 30s, the number of vaccines that are available right now. And almost none of them have been tested with this gold standard that is required for FDA approval for anything else besides a vaccine.
Well, let me ask you this. Was polio a real thing? Was measles a real thing? And if so, where did it come from? How did all these people get it at the same time, and how did it go away?
Right. Well, polio is a great example to talk about, and it certainly was a real thing. And in fact, poliomyelitis refers to a neurologic condition. It doesn't refer to a virus. It was much, much later that they used the term polio to mean a virus. So what polio meant was that there was a specific type of lesion or disease in the spinal cord. And it was identified, like after someone died from it, they could make sections of the spinal cord and look under a microscope and identify a specific type of pattern. And that was what poliomyelitis was. In fact, the term myelo in myelitis refers to the spinal cord.
How did people get it?
Well, that's exactly what I'm getting to. So poliomyelitis was a seasonal illness. It occurred in the summer. And in the beginning of this disease, they were having some invasive species of moths that came over to the United States. And this was a real problem because these moths, the gypsy moth was the first one, but there were others after that. They would basically destroy all of these trees. And it became a real problem to the forest and the agriculture. So they didn't know how to contain the moths. So someone developed a chemical pesticide that would work, and that was called lead arsenate. So it was a combination of lead and arsenic. And I think we all know that lead and arsenic are very toxic to humans. We know that arsenic can be used to murder someone by poisoning. And we know that lead is something we need to watch out in the water and with paint so that our kids don't have intellectual disabilities. So they were basically going around and dousing large quantities of lead and arsenic all around people's yards, all around agriculture. They were putting it on their fruits and vegetables, all to prevent devastation from this gypsy moth. And I believe there's quite a lot of evidence to support a very strong correlation that this is actually what caused poliomyelitis. And we also know that the toxicity of those metals is specifically targeted to the nervous system above all else. So it wouldn't be a big leap of faith to reason that if we are exposing everyone to toxic metals that are neurological toxins, and then people are getting neurological illness, that is the cause.
Okay, so is there a backstory to measles then too? I mean, it's almost like, okay, let's look at real history now. We've been taught the false history. Let's look at the real stuff now, Brian, you know? So is there a backstory to measles as well? I mean, why was there this huge outbreak of measles and chickenpox and smallpox?
Right. Well, you know, I could come up with some theories about it, but the reason I haven't spent a lot of time looking into measles is because measles is essentially a harmless disease. Some of your viewers who are old enough might remember the Brady Bunch. And there was a famous Brady Bunch episode where everyone in the family came down with the measles. And it portrayed them basically hanging out, not having to go to school, and having a good old time. Right. And, you know, they had some red blotches on their skin. And, you know, when I talked to my mom, who remembered her childhood when everyone had the measles, that was consistent with her memory of it. It really hardly affected anyone in a serious way, except for those young children who were already ill with some other serious condition.
So was that a contagious illness?
Well, that's what it was called. But once again, there is no experimental proof that it was contagious.
Mm-hmm. So I've also heard in regard to measles, if measles were taken care of through some kind of, you know, medical intervention and not allowed to go, then a high amount of cases in children who weren't allowed to just go through measles. The ones who went through measles had a better chance of not developing cancer and other illnesses later on in life. Is there truth to that?
Yes, there absolutely is with respect to measles, that people who had natural measles did have a lower risk of certain other illnesses later in life. Yes, I've seen that research. I don't remember all the details, but certainly that is out there and people can find it.
Okay, so let's now that we've opened the can of worms on vaccines, and I don't want to give anybody the impression that I'm pro-vax, because I've always been anti-vax my entire life. Even when I didn't know why I was anti-vax, it just didn't seem like a good idea to put a chemical cocktail of some government subsidized substance into my veins, because I've had kind of an inherent distrust of government. So why would I let them put some kind of chemical that I have no idea what it is into my veins and my kids' veins? It doesn't make any sense. But what are the risks of somebody getting vaccines? Because what we're seeing right now is Bill Gates is saying, yeah, if you want to travel, you need to produce your vaccine certificate, and we need a vaccine for every man, woman, and child on the earth. We see that they're trying to push vaccines through Inovio and Merck and all these pharmaceutical companies. And you even had Trump doing an unboxing of Abbott Labs test kit. It's like he was the pharmaceutical rep. He became pharmaceutical rep Trump instead of President Trump for that 5-minute period. But we see this push for vaccines. What is the downside? What's the harm? What's the detriment to the human body if you accept something like that into your system?
Right. Well, I want to start that off with one really important point, because if there's actually no real evidence that vaccines prevent you from getting ill, there's really no reason to even consider if they're toxic or not, because they offer no benefit.
Right.
So you don't even really have to look at that. But unfortunately, I have looked at that, and I've looked at it very carefully, and I'll tell you that the potential adverse effects are quite devastating and largely kind of hidden from the public eye. So, for example,
are we talking about documented, verifiable effects?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And the reason that they're hidden from the public eye is because there was a law that was passed which essentially removed any product liability from vaccine manufacturers. So this is really important, because you know that when you make a product that people use, if you don't pay attention to safety and people get hurt from that product, like, for example, I have a relative who was working in this area of law and was involved in this big lawsuit against a fireplace manufacturer of gas fireplaces. And they had some faulty components, and it caused people's houses to burn down. So as a remedy, the people who had that happen were able to sue the company and get compensation so that they could buy a new home. And hopefully they didn't need any medical expenses and they were healthy, but it would also pay for that. So if you're a company that makes vaccines, you don't have that liability at all. If someone gets hurt from a vaccine, they cannot sue that company. Instead, what happened is that the government set up a special court that is hidden from the public view. It's not reported upon in the major journals. And I think there might even be a non-disclosure agreement that people have to sign if they use that venue. And a lot of people with vaccine injuries actually don't even know this exists. And so they don't seek a remedy there. But it's like this special government court, and they do look at people who have vaccine injury claims, and they pay out awards, and they've paid out billions of dollars in awards. And
at taxpayer expense, right? Not at pharmaceutical expense.
Well, yeah, was my next point. Yeah, we are paying for that. So essentially, the drug companies get to keep all their profits and get a out of jail free card, and never have to pay the expense of the problem. So that creates even a worse situation, because why would they even look at the safety very carefully if it wasn't their responsibility or going to cut into their bottom line?
Right.
And I'll tell you that further, also the government set up a reporting system and a database to capture all of the adverse events from vaccines. And it's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, VAERS. And actually anyone can go to the website and look through their spreadsheet and see what kind of reactions have been reported. But I want to tell you that this is a completely voluntary reporting system, and many physicians are not even aware that it exists. So if, let's say that I'm a pediatrician and I'm routinely giving vaccines, and I give a vaccine to a child, and the next day the parent calls me and said that their child is seriously ill. So I could voluntarily then, as the doctor, make a report to this system, but I am under absolutely no obligation to do so. So it puts the onus on someone who is very busy seeing tons of patients that they would have to stop what they're doing, take extra time to figure out how to fill out the paperwork or do whatever's required for the reporting. And so many times people do not report it. In fact, the CDC actually funded researchers at Harvard to look more closely at this because they wanted to know if the VAERS is accurately capturing any adverse events from vaccines. And I think when they decided to do this, I think they assumed that they would find that no, that it's capturing everything and there's nothing more. But the researchers at Harvard actually concluded that the VAERS system captures less than 1% of all adverse effects from vaccines. And once they communicated this result back to the CDC stopped the project. So it did not go to its conclusion. There's no scientific publication that I'm aware of, but there are publications in news media and interviews with the scientists that can give you the results. But this, to, in my opinion, was a travesty of justice, because if the current data only represents 1%, then that means there are a heck of a lot of people out there with injuries from vaccines. And I've looked through this database a little bit myself, and I mean, I haven't spent hours and hours poring over it, but I definitely saw cases in there of death. And I saw cases in there of something called Guillain-Barré syndrome that some of you may be familiar with, which is essentially paralysis. And this has been highly associated with the influenza vaccine, but it's also been associated in that database with other vaccines.
Yeah, there was actually a 60 Minutes thing back in 1976, I think it was, or 78. Do you remember that lady?
Yes.
I think Mike Wallace did the report on it.
Yes, that was the swine flu epidemic of 76. And
yep.
I was a young boy at that time, and I remember my parents getting that vaccine.
Yeah. Is that the one that leaves that big mark? No, that's the measles, mumps, rubella, isn't it?
That's the smallpox vaccine, which they don't use anymore.
Do you have that one on your arm?
No, I think I was born a year or two after they stopped that.
Really? Jeez, I wish I was. Okay, so let me see. What do you let me ask you this, because I hypothesize that there's something behind these tests, because we heard Nancy Pelosi say the main driver of the stimulus package is testing. Trump's getting up there going, you got to take your test, you got to take your shots. The World Health Organization said it's if there's one key takeaway from this whole talk, it's test. So they're really pushing these tests. And then I saw the guy from Project Veritas the other day, he does a lot of really good exposure undercover videos. And so he went undercover and had them film him they did the nose swab test and the swab in the mouth. Is it possible that the developers of this test, and this to me, it's a follow the money thing. It's key bono. Who's benefiting off of making these tests, and what are they depositing into you through that swab? What are they taking from you? Because there are swabs that actually extract DNA, and when you take it to a lab, they basically have your DNA on file. So what do you think about that? Is that just a mad theory from some conspiracy theorist, or could there be any validity to that?
Well, I mean, if it was just a matter of wanting to take our DNA, I think there's many, many ways they could do that. Like, for example, when a baby is born, they do a heel stick and take a blood sample, and they say that it's to screen for some genetic diseases, right, like PKU. Mm-hmm. But they could certainly do a genetic analysis on that if they wanted to. I mean, these days, all you need is a little bit of saliva.
Right.
So I don't think there's any, evidence that they're putting anything into your body or that they're doing a test for something else that's going into a database. But what they are doing is, so this test is for RNA. It's not for a virus. And in fact, it's never been compared to a gold standard test where they actually isolated and purified a virus out of a sick person, and then also did this PCR genetic test and said, well, 100% of the time, if there's a virus there, this genetic test is positive. And in healthy people, 100% of the time, there's no virus there and the test is negative. If the genetic test was subjected to that kind of a scientific study, then it would be very reliable, and you'd be able to calculate an error rate, because every test has an error rate. Nothing is perfect. But this test, it's impossible to calculate an error rate because there's no gold standard for comparison. Right. So there was a group that came out of Hong Kong, I believe, that tried to use a mathematical model to estimate it. And one of the ways they did this is they would give someone a test and then follow them out for several weeks and see, did they get sick or not? And they estimated that there was a false positive rate of 80% in people who did not have symptoms of a respiratory illness. So what that means is testing people who have been exposed, who have been traveling, but who are not yet showing symptoms, that 4 out of 5 times they have a positive test, they actually don't have the illness. So this could be a way of mislabeling many, many people as having the illness. And of course, it could inflate the numbers, right. But it has other consequences, because if there's a positive test, you're being reported to a health agency, and there are police powers that have been enacted that could allow you to be removed from your family or detained against your will based upon the results of this. So it's a very, very scary situation.
Well, let's wrap up with 2 things. The first thing is, okay, so what's going to induce exosomes? We know that what's going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with mainstream media is that people are feeding on the fear. They watch the Johns Hopkins number blow up. They see these red dots blowing up in their area or near their area. They hear people coming down with COVID-19. They're scared to death of coming on, it coming to them or them coming to it or whatever. And so people are obeying the governing authorities because they're scared. And people who are fearful are irrational. Irrational people make bad decisions. So is one of the ways to release these exosomes to cause stress in people by, turning on? I tell people, if you want to combat COVID-19, step number 1, turn off your TV. Get rid of the fear. Get a little bit of peace and quiet in your life. But is there something to say about the power of suggestion when Wolf Blitzer or Jake Tapper or Brian Stelter on CNN is always telling you, oh my God, the numbers are going up. We're not going to get out of this thing unless you stay in. We're not even close to flattening the curve. We're not at the apex, like Andrew Cuomo says. Is there something to be said about that suggestion of fear that's going to cause people to be, have a weakened immune system?
Well, yes, absolutely. When you're experiencing extreme fear, your body puts all of its energy into basic survival. Right. And that doesn't necessarily include your normal immune system's function. So with respect to the exosomes, there are many studies that have looked at what are the factors that cause your body to make exosomes. And exosomes are these little vesicles that bud out of your cells. So they're part of your own cell. They're from your own body. And they also contain the same exact genetic material as the alleged COVID-19 virus, which is RNA. And they have the same exact receptor on them, which targets them to another area of the body where they're going to communicate information as the alleged COVID virus. And the different things that cause your body to send out these exosomes include, as I said, exposure to toxic substances, psychological stress, which includes extreme fear, like you just mentioned. So right. you could definitely, through fear, release these exosomes, which could possibly cause a false positive test. Cancer causes you to release exosomes. Being exposed to radiation, ionizing radiation, like we're talking about radioactivity. Any infectious illness, any immune response to an illness, asthma, Some articles seem to say that almost any disease could cause this because it's basically seen as a mechanism that would help us heal from disease by allowing remote communication between cells. Our cells are pretty small, and it's really hard for a cell in your brain to talk to a cell in your kidney. So you could think about these as little parcels that contain information. And there's, like a little UPS guy bringing the exosome from one part of your body to the other, giving a message that there's something bad going on. Will you come help out?
All right. So let me just ask you about, there's a lot of people out there saying that 5G is directly related to what's going on with the COVID-19 virus. So can you tell us anything? What do you know about it? What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Well, like I said, since there's not any real research trying to look for an alternative cause, it's really hard to say what's really going on. And then in addition, there doesn't seem to be any real spike in mortality compared to any other year in terms of deaths. So it's hard to say that there's any new illness at all going on right now, but there certainly could be. And certainly there are some reports here and there of people observing some people to appear to be more ill than they're used to. But it's really hard to say what is what. But 5G has definitely been put forth by a lot of people as a potential cause of illness. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that it certainly causes a lot of health problems. So, going back to the initial development of this kind of microwave EMF technology, it was developed for military applications such as crowd control. And it's actually been used for that purpose in various situations. And there is a wealth of scientific studies looking not just at 5G, but even looking at our older cell technology. For example, there's a very strong correlation between the number of hours that you hold a cell phone against your ear and developing a certain type of tumor called an acoustic neuroma inside your brain. So that's been very well established. There's also our own government's researchers at Los Alamos National Laboratory. They have done some studies on the terahertz wave scanners, which are the body scanners used at the airport. And that's a very similar technology to 5G. And what they have shown is that those electromagnetic waves actually cause DNA damage in living cells. And we all know that DNA damage is associated with illnesses like cancer. So, and there are many.
Do you know if cancer rates went up when with the inception of the scanners at the airports in 2001?
Right. Well, I do know that the TSA personnel who work in proximity to those scanners have had lots of health problems and have high rates of disability.
Interesting. All right. One last question, and ironically, it deals with what we talked about earlier before we went on the air. It's the first question I had in my community section from Ruben K. He said, how do you stand your ground and resist mandatory forced vaccinations if and when it comes into effect, assuming the research proves their toxicity and harm?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, and it's something I have certainly been putting a lot of effort into thinking about. And what I feel is the best strategy is that I learned about this gentleman named Cal Washington. And he is an individual who has, through his own experience and through his own learning, has studied how the law is practiced and enforced in our country. And he even actually had to spend some time behind bars to figure this out. And his only crime was not having insurance for his car. So he's a very moral person. He would definitely not cause harm to any other individual. But through this experience, he has gained a level of knowledge that is pretty incredible. And he joined up with other people in this area, and they formed this group called In Power that I would definitely, refer your audience to check out. And what they did is they came up with this legal strategy, which is it's called a notice of liability. And it's based on the fact that anything that we are compelled to do in our society, such as get a driver's license, get automobile insurance, pay taxes, have mandatory vaccines. All of these things are in the form of a contract. And we actually agree to these things, even though it seems like they're required even without our agreement. We actually did give our agreement, we just didn't state it outright. And this is kind of a little bit of a trick that could be used to get us to go along with things when we don't realize that we can actually withdraw our consent at any time. So what this strategy involves is it looks at the required vaccines as a contract. And what we say is that we will accept that contract and allow these vaccines to be given to us on certain conditions. And the condition is that you can show us conclusive evidence, like 99.9999% conclusive evidence, that vaccines are effective at preventing illness and are safe, that we will not get any kind of injury whatsoever from the vaccines except for 1 in 10 million people. And that's the 99.9999. And we say that if you're unable to demonstrate clear evidence that these vaccines are safe and effective to those requirements that we specify in the notice, and you still force us to accept the mandatory or the vaccine, that you will be personally liable for a sum of $10 million. So we would send this notice to the government officials who have taken an oath under the Constitution, promising to protect and defend the Constitution, which is our rights to freedom of choice, and that we can with consent or withdraw consent to these. And since they would be violating that, then they would be held personally liable for this money. And if, let's say that 100 people sent this notice to the health department official in their county, well, then they would be liable for over $1 billion. So this strategy is not just theoretical, it's actually been used in the real world in 3 or 4 different cities. And it was not used for vaccines, it was used for smart meters, which is a special kind of electric meter that, in various areas they try to put on everyone's home. And it causes some people to get quite ill because of the electromagnetic radiation. So this is also related to 5G. And so there were people who didn't want this installed on their house, and the utility companies were saying that they had to, or if they didn't, they had to pay a fine, which would render them unable to afford electricity. And so they used this strategy, and no one that used this strategy was forced to put a smart meter on. And several times this happened, that within a very short time of the government official in charge of this receiving this notice, that they resigned from office. And there was even a CEO of a utility company who was sent this notice who resigned from office. So it was extremely effective. Basically what happened is the politicians saw that if they didn't step down, they were going to owe millions and millions of dollars. And it's not just that they have a bill that they owe this money. This document actually allows you to take a commercial lien on the person. So you could potentially garnish their wages, you could seize their property and take ownership of it if they don't pay the liability claim. So the politicians realized that. I could imagine them taking the document, being confused about what it is, going down to the county attorney and saying, would you take a look at this and tell me what it means? And then a couple of hours later, the attorney comes in and says, well, you're in deep trouble. If you don't give these people a pass, they're going to make you bankrupt.
Well, will that also work in reality with somebody who already took the smart meter and then comes into the knowledge of, hey, I could have taken this road?
Yes. So it's never too late to amend the terms of the contract. So you can do this, but with vaccines, once you get a vaccine, there is no going back.
Right.
So it's something that so Cal and his group are feverishly just the document is almost complete. There's just a couple of small revisions that need to be made, and then it'll be ready to be rolled out. So Cal and I are actually going to both appear together on Richie from Boston's YouTube channel tomorrow evening at 5:30 Eastern, and we're going to lay out this strategy in more detail than I'm describing it now. And he's really the main legal expert. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems with vaccines and how the document addresses those. Okay. But I'm really excited, and I have a lot of hope that this remedy is going to be very effective, and it's going to be the most effective if a lot of people do it together. Right. So like I'm involved with a group in my community of people who are concerned about vaccines, and they are eagerly awaiting this information. And I think right after they hear about how it works, they're all going to be ready to get on board, and we're all going to do this together.
That's awesome. And we talked about this before we went on air too, is that, truth is treason in the empire of lies. It truly, truly is. There are people who want the deception. They want the cloak of just lies and evil, and just they want to get away from truth, and they want to do it to make money. They want it to accumulate power or whatever. And it's always the people who suffer. But if we lift off the lid of deception and find out exactly what's going on and arm ourselves with knowledge, it can be a completely different outcome. But like I said to you earlier, and like I always tell my audience, if we don't stick together, if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. So with some closing thoughts, what do you want to leave with the audience about COVID-19, about the fact that people are in fear for their lives, and just talk to that average person on the streets who really buys into what mainstream media is telling them? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with you 100%. It's time to turn off the TV. And if you want to learn about what's going on, I encourage you to find your own information and figure this out for yourself. Just get out a computer and think, what is it important to know about? And search for that and find the information. Because just seeing that, for example, in an average year in the world, there are between 300,000 and 700,000 deaths from the flu, an average flu. Well, there's nowhere near that number of deaths from COVID-19, not even close. And in an average year, we have that many deaths, and we don't hide in our homes. We don't stay away from other people. We are not afraid of other people, and we go about our lives. And so you have to then ask yourself, why are we subjected to these extreme measures now when there's no objective evidence of a real risk? And if you can get to that point and ask that question and look for the answer, then you're on the path to freedom. Because once you have the truth, then you are truly free to make your own decisions about how you're going to deal with this issue and how you want our lives to be after this is all over. Because I really liked the way things were. They certainly weren't perfect, and there was a lot of tyranny at some level, but nothing like this Orwellian outlook that seems to be on the horizon.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so, and I'm going to help you guys out. What I'm going to do is the links to everything that I can think of that Andrew and I talked about in this video, I'm going to put them in the description, and I'm going to put them in the pinned comment, including the link to Andrew's website. You have a website, right?
Yes, I do. It's about to be fully operational, but I do have an address, and it's ready to go.
Okay, so I'll leave Andrew's link to his website, the link to his YouTube channel. Every way you can contact and get a hold of information from Andrew is going to be in the links in the description below. Below Andrew's information, I'm going to have the links to everything, like show notes, source links, everything to get you guys on the path. And we're talking about Anthony Fauci's own writings, what the CDC says, what the World Health Organization says, so you can see the contradictions that they come up with to try to box us in and get us to think that freedom is slavery, like Andrew just mentioned from George Orwell. Freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. They really want you to believe that. And the way they're foisting this on you is by stoking the fires of fear inside of you. So, Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on. And I don't know if you'd be interested in coming on again so we can talk in a little bit more detail about some things that we missed, because I'm sure we missed a lot of things, but I really enjoyed having you on, man.
Yeah, it was really great to be here. And, you asked some really important questions, so I really appreciate the opportunity. And I would certainly love to come back sometime. Thank you, Brian.
Awesome, man. You have a good one. I really appreciate it.
You too.